The structure and function of the heart is discussed in this screencast. You may find this topic in Chapter 11 of your textbook. This screencast was designed to achieve the following objectives. Describe the location of the heart. Describe the pericardium. Describe the flow of blood through the heart to the pulmonary and systemic circulations. Describe the two types of heart valves. Describe the coronary circulation. And define ischemia, angina pectoris, and myocardial infarct. The heart lies between the lungs superior to the diaphragm and posterior to the sternum. It is about the size of a clenched fist with 2/3 of its mass left of the midline. The apex points inferiorly and laterally toward the left hip. The most superior region of the heart is the base, which is where the great vessels attach to the heart, effectively connecting the heart to the rest of the body. The heart is contained in a cavity within a cavity within a cavity, and I'm going to illustrate what I mean. The heart, of course, is found in the thoracic cavity, which contains the lungs as well as the heart. The mediastinum is a cavity within the thoracic cavity that contains the heart and the great vessels that attach to the base of the heart. The heart proper is found in the pericardial cavity, which is formed by a serous membrane called the pericardium. The pericardium is a closed sac, so the heart literally beats within a closed sac, composed of two layers. The fibrous pericardium is anchored to the diaphragm and the great vessels. The serous pericardium contains two layers, the parietal layer, which is attached to the fibrous pericardium, and then we have the visceral layer, which is also called the epicardium, and it's attached directly to the myocardium, or the cardiac muscle tissue of the heart. Notice that there is this potential space between the two layers of serous pericardium. The cells of the serous pericardium secrete a lubricating fluid. This fluid ensures that there is very little friction between the visceral and parietal layers as they slide across one another as the heart beats. Under certain circumstances, the pericardial cavity can accumulate fluid, generally in response to inflammation, and in some instances this accumulated fluid can compress the heart and prevent it from beating properly. The heart wall, which makes up the mass of the heart and surrounds each of its chambers, is composed of an outer layer, which is the visceral layer of the serous pericardium, which we've just talked about. The middle layer, which is the thickest of the layers of the heart wall, the myocardium, contains the cardiac muscle cells responsible for contraction and propulsion of blood, and the inner layer, the endocardium, contains simple squamous epithelial cells which form a smooth, friction-free surface to ensure the smooth flow of blood through the heart. The cells of the endocardium are the same type of cells that line the blood vessels. Cells of the endocardium and the lining of the blood vessels are the only cells that come in contact with the blood as it flows through the cardiovascular system. So it's very important that there is very little resistance to blood flow provided by these cells. Cardiac muscle cells are called myocytes. Myocytes are organized into concentric or circular layers which wrap around the chambers of the heart. This arrangement allows the heart to squeeze blood from its chambers as you might squeeze toothpaste from a toothpaste tube. The human heart consists of 4 chambers. The upper chambers are called the atria. The atria are receiving chambers. They don't actually pump blood through the body. Instead, they receive blood returning to the heart through veins, and then they move that blood into the lower chambers, which are called the ventricles. The ventricles take up most of the volume of the heart. They are the actual pumps, the discharging chambers. They create the pressure gradient that allows blood to move from the heart through arteries, through the systemic and pulmonary circuits of the body. Recall that the heart sends blood to two locations, the pulmonary circuit and the systemic circuit. So the ventricles act as two separate pumps. The right ventricle provides a pressure gradient to move blood through the pulmonary circuit. When the right ventricle contracts, deoxygenated or oxygen poor blood moves through the pulmonary artery to the pulmonary capillaries located in the lungs. There, oxygen is loaded into the blood and carbon dioxide is unloaded. The oxygen-rich or oxygenated blood is then returned to the left atrium through the pulmonary veins. Oxygen-rich blood or oxygenated blood returned to the left atrium, then moves into the left ventricle. The left ventricle provides a pressure gradient that will then move blood through the systemic circuit. So oxygenated or oxygen-rich blood leaves the left ventricle through the aorta and enters all of the systemic arteries. The systemic arteries take blood to the systemic capillaries. The systemic capillaries are located all over the body, all the way from capillaries in the brain to capillaries in the foot. In the systemic capillaries, oxygen is unloaded and provided to the tissues. Carbon dioxide is loaded into the blood from the tissues. So now we have deoxygenated or oxygen poor blood. That deoxygenated blood is then returned to the right atrium. And from the right atrium, the deoxygenated blood enters the right ventricle. And now we're back where we started. Now let's look specifically at how blood flows through the heart. To understand how the heart functions, you must understand how blood flows through the heart. And you will be required to answer a question on the exam that specifically tests your knowledge of how blood flows through the heart. So deoxygenated blood returns to the right atrium through one of three veins. The superior vena cava brings deoxygenated blood from the systemic circuit superior to the heart. The inferior vena cava returns deoxygenated blood to the body from the systemic circulation below or inferior to the heart. And this opening here represents the third vein that's returning deoxygenated blood to the right atrium from the coronary circuit. So we have deoxygenated blood entering the right atrium through these three veins. From there, deoxygenated blood is moved into the right ventricle. When the right ventricle contracts, it creates a pressure gradient that moves blood into the pulmonary trunk. The pulmonary trunk then branches into two right pulmonary arteries and two left pulmonary arteries, which take the deoxygenated blood to the right and left lungs respectively. There, oxygen is loaded, carbon dioxide is unloaded, and then deoxygenated blood is brought back to the heart, to the left atrium specifically, through two pulmonary veins, two right pulmonary veins, and two left pulmonary veins, bringing oxygenated blood from the right and left lungs respectively. The oxygenated blood now moves from the left atrium into the left ventricle. The left ventricle contracts and provides the pressure gradient to move blood into the ascending aorta, and from the ascending aorta, blood is moved to all of the systemic capillaries of the entire body. To ensure that blood flows in one direction through the heart and one direction only, the heart has 4 valves. 2 of these valves are located between the atria and the ventricles, and they are aptly named atrioventricular valves, or simply AV valve. The right AV valve is the mitral valve, and the left AV valve is the bicuspid valve. To understand better how these valves function, let's look more closely at their anatomy. This figure from your book shows the atrioventricular valves in an open position shown on the left and a closed position shown on the right. First, let's examine a couple of features of a typical AV valve. The leaflets are the structures that actually open and close, allowing or not allowing blood to flow through. Those leaflets are connected to little fibrous structures called chordae tendineae, literally heart cords or heartstrings, and these chordae tendineae are attached to papillary muscles. When there is a greater pressure in the atrium than the ventricle, the AV valve is in the open position as shown on the left, and blood is allowed to flow from the atrium into the ventricle. When the ventricle contracts and now pressure is greater in the ventricle than the atrium, the valve closes as shown on the right. The papillary muscles contract and pull on the chordae tendineae, which pull on the leaflets and prevent the leaflets from flaring up into the atrium. Without the chordae tendineae, the greater pressure in the ventricle would likely cause the leaflets to flare up into the atrium, sort of like how an umbrella is turned inside out when it catches the wind, and this would allow blood to backflow into the atrium. So the papillary muscles and chordae tendineae play a very critical role in preventing the backflow of blood through an AV valve. There are also valves located at the openings to the pulmonary trunk and the aorta. They are called semilunar valves because they resemble half moons. You have the pulmonary semilunar valve at the opening of the pulmonary trunk and the aortic semilunar valve at the opening of the aorta. The semilunar valves are much less remarkable than the AV valves. This figure illustrates that the semilunar valves are composed of 3 cup-like leaflets with the open end of the cup facing the lumen. Also, there are no chordae tendineae associated with the semilunar valves. This figure illustrates how a greater pressure in the ventricles opens the semilunar valves. When pressure is greater in the ventricles than in the great vessels, the leaflets are easily pushed aside to allow blood to flow from the ventricles into the vessels. As the ventricles relax and pressure in the vessels now exceed that of the ventricles, the leaflets slam shut, preventing the backflow of blood from the vessels back into the ventricles. The heart is a very active organ, beating continuously even when you sleep. So it's not surprising that though it's only 1/200th of the mass of the body, it consumes about 1/20th the total blood supply of the body. But the heart cannot utilize the blood that it actually pumps. The blood moves through the heart too quickly, and many cells of the heart are too far away or too far removed from the blood in the chambers. Instead, the heart has its own coronary circulation. Oxygenated blood is delivered to the tissues of the heart by the left and right coronary arteries. These arteries branch from the aorta, which is an artery that carries oxygenated blood to the systemic circulation. So these coronary arteries, the right and left coronary arteries, branch into many smaller arteries not illustrated in this figure. Those arteries lead to coronary capillaries, and there the typical exchange of carbon dioxide and oxygen and nutrients between the blood of the coronary capillaries and the tissues of the heart occur. So deoxygenated blood leaves the coronary capillaries via coronary veins. All coronary veins lead to one central location, the coronary sinus, this large coronary vein which is located on the posterior side of the heart. From the coronary sinus, the deoxygenated blood is moved to the right atrium and mixes with deoxygenated blood from the systemic circulation. I would like to return for a moment to the coronary arteries. So the right and left coronary arteries branch into much smaller coronary arteries, which are not shown here, but nevertheless, they are there. If those coronary arteries become partially blocked, you have a condition called ischemia, where there's a decreased blood supply to an area of the heart. With this decrease in blood supply, there's a decrease in oxygen delivery to cells. That will force those cells to use anaerobic respiration as a means to generate ATP, or energy. Along with anaerobic respiration comes a buildup of lactic acid. That lactic acid stimulates pain receptors, and you have a condition called angina pectoris, where there is this crushing, choking pain beneath the sternum as a result of the ischemia. In situations where there is a very severe ischemia, or if there is total blockage of an artery, that causes insufficient supply of blood and oxygen to cells, and cells die, or you have what's called an infarct. Specifically in the heart, it's called a myocardial infarct, or MI, and a myocardial infarct is a heart attack. When cells of the heart die, the heart is weakened as there are fewer cells available to pump blood. Now let's review the objectives of the screencast. Describe the location of the heart, describe the pericardium, describe the flow of blood through the heart to the pulmonary and systemic circulations, describe the two types of heart valves, describe the coronary circulation, and define ischemia, angina pectoris, and myocardial infarct. The topic of the next screencast will be cardiac muscle cells.